You are listening to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda. Today is a real treat for me because we have the return of Sheldon Birnie. Sheldon is a writer, music fan, dad, and beer league hockey player in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, hometown of propaganda. When I was planning out the Dear Coach's Corner episode way back in early 2021, Sheldon's name was floated to me by someone else in Winnipeg, but I can't quite remember who. Maybe Sam Thompson from Witch Police Radio, or Jamie Fougere, who has done a lot of podcast artwork for this show, and maybe it was Randy Frickus who filmed the failed Imagineer video. Anyway, Sheldon and I had an absolute blast talking about hockey, Winnipeg, and Dear Coach's Corner for episode 50. A few months after that, I met Sheldon at the propaganda shows in October of 2021 in Winnipeg, and we had a great chat. And I am delighted to bring you a conversation about his book, Missing Like Teeth, an oral history of Winnipeg underground rock from 1990 to 2001. This book is out of print and only had a print run of about 500 copies. It sometimes pops up online used, but the best way to get it is on an e-reader for very cheap. If you are interested in the history of Winnipeg rock, which everyone who listens to this podcast should consider doing, check it out if you can. It's very good, and it has tons of great interviews and content from John K. Sampson, Chris Hanna, George Samoleski, Todd Kowalski, but also other past members of this podcast cast, such as Greg McPherson, Derek Riel, and Jameel Russell, as well as G7 member and Agassi drummer Derek Hogue, the legendary musician Biff Naked, and former propaganda bassist Scott Hopper. The book is really good, so please enjoy my conversation with Sheldon Birnie on his book, Missing Like Teeth. Sheldon Birnie, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here, Sheldon. I'm wondering if you can spend a moment and introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know a little bit about you and your work.
Okay. Well, my name is Sheldon Birnie. I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. I'm a reporter by trade, I guess, a community journalist for the Free Press Community Review, which is a free weekly publication in Winnipeg that covers the community stuff that the Daily doesn't quite touch on. A number of years ago, I guess 8 years ago now, I wrote a book about Winnipeg's underground music scene, which is called Missing Like Teeth, an oral history of Winnipeg's underground rock from 1990 to 2001. And that book was a great experience, and we're gonna dig into it here. Yeah.
I'm so excited. Sheldon, how did you get interested in general, just like in writing? How did this grip you and take you down this professional path?
That goes way back to like an interest when I was a kid in just writing stories, basically, ripping off or rewriting, like Monty Python sketches or whatever, and I just kept doing it because that's what you do sometimes. I guess I had some early encouragement or found, early on outlets that were directed towards like youth writing and youth art in Canada. There was one publication in particular called Into Print that had a mandate to, focus on and publish and give experience to youth. I think it was like 12 or 14 to 19 years old. I was around for 3 or 4 years before it kind of went under. I think it had some, government was reliant on government funding, but that got me the experience early on of submitting and getting rejected, but continuing, like not giving up. And kind of got into that, into doing that. And from there, just, found opportunities to practice writing, whether it was, on my own or through zines or submitting to literary journals. And then later on, when I went to University of Manitoba, that involved getting involved with the community, or not the community, the student paper there, the Manitoban. And then from there, that opened up, that journalism was a way to maybe make money or to sort of make money. And so I would, found myself pursuing those opportunities. And then here we are today. I just keep trying to find ways to do it, as that's what I like to do.
Amazing. Well, in the future, you and I know we have some plans to chat about some of your novels as well. So we'll get to the fiction and the creative aspect of literature in future episodes that we're planning on doing. But today we're going to talk a little bit about some nonfiction.
Yeah.
that you did, like you mentioned, Missing Like Teeth, an oral history of Winnipeg underground rock from 1990 to 2001. I want to know a little bit about your experience with music, kind of set the stage
Right.
here for your context and your burgeoning interest in music and the Winnipeg scene that you came to document later on through this book. Kind of take me back to your origin and entry into this world.
Okay, well, I grew up in northern BC, so a town called Dawson Creek, which is about 6 hours north west of Edmonton, Alberta. So there wasn't really any sort of, music scene going on there. There's a couple, dudes in every grade who played like, some sort of Nirvana ripoff or Pantera ripoff kind of stuff, which is great and fine. But there wasn't any real, like no bands would tour there. There was no scene whatsoever. But coming and spending time in the summers in Manitoba, where my parents are from and my extended family all live, I got introduced to, punk rock music, underground kind of music. And then from there, found out that, Much Music, which was like the MTV in Canada, had a late night show for about half an hour on Fridays called The Wedge, which played indie underground videos. And so was able to then realize that there are these bands doing really cool stuff, and holy, you can mail order, you can write them a letter and send them a money order for $12 and get the latest CD from the Kittens or whatever. And so from there was hooked on that this was a thing that was happening. It was happening in Canada, it was happening in the States, it was happening in Winnipeg, which to me was a place that I had access to and understood on a level. Living close to Edmonton, I never really spent any time there. We'd kind of just drive through it to Manitoba, occasional hockey tournament or school trip there, but it wasn't a place that I connected with or got to know in any meaningful way. Vancouver was, but that's again 12-13 hour drive south, and never spent much more than a couple days a year there at the most, either visiting friends, family. So Winnipeg became the place that I started to find out that there's a band from there. There's these cool bands from there, a band called Kittens, which had a few records on Sonic Onion, which were, they're fantastic, a really kind of underappreciated noise rock, I guess you'd kind of call them, band.
Mm-hmm.
And then, by dint of, Fat Records and working in kitchens and hanging out with punks and getting to be friends with, kids who like that kind of stuff, discovered this band called Propaganda, which of course were from Winnipeg. And to me, that was like, whoa, there's this band of Fat Records that is from Winnipeg, and they appear to be, skids like me and my pals who sing about hockey and whatever. And so from there, it was, by that point, they had already put out a couple records, and I believe had started their record label, which also featured, the Weaker Thans and other acts that were connected to them through Winnipeg. And so for me, it became a almost like a mecca of this kind of stuff that was happening because it was accessible. I could spend time there. I could visualize what they're talking about, where these shows were going on. So when I got old enough to start attending those shows in the summer, that became a big thing for me.
Amazing. This is great. So this book. Oh, so what era are you
This would have been the
entering?
late 90s, 2000. I graduated 2001, so would have came into actually seeing this stuff at the end of it when some of these bands were already established. And then the legend of the bands that came before was what you'd hear about from the older punks or the older, dudes you're working with or playing music with or whatever. So there's a lot of legendary kind of status to places like the Albert or Le Rendezvous that you'd hear from these guys who were there when it happened, kind of thing. And so in my mind, it built up like this was a spot that doesn't get the attention of Montreal, say, or Toronto or Vancouver. Vancouver's punk scene, of course, in the 90s was also pretty big and pretty cool. And so to me, it was like, why aren't more people talking about Winnipeg? But I mean, that's the case no matter what you're talking about, whether it's sports or culture or whatever. If you're from Winnipeg, you have this kind of attitude that you're overlooked a bit, and that could be a little rightly so, and a little bit maybe just a chip on the shoulder. But to me, it seemed like something had happened here and no one had really documented it. I guess we'd fast forward to 2011 or 12 or 13-ish. I started writing freelance for Vice Canada, which, Vice had established a Canadian office and were really kind of aggressively trying to cover stories that weren't being covered. So I kind of got my foot in the door after a lot of pitching there. And at the same time, they also had Noisy, which was their music, I don't know what you call it, imprint or magazine online platform. And the same thing, they were establishing a Canadian footprint. So I quickly was connected with the editor there, Slava Pastuk, the infamous Slava. And he kind of just greenlit a lot of the stuff I was doing. And one of the first things I did for him was, can I just write about this scene in Winnipeg that existed back in the day and what its connections were to the music that was happening at that time, I guess about 2014 or 13 or whatever it was. And the response to that was huge. So I ended up doing a number of kind of follow-up pieces with different kind of scenes that had, rather than a general overview. And then from those articles, which again got a lot of shares, a lot of interest in them, finally kind of putting the spotlight on Winnipeg on a national scene. The folks at Eternal Cavalier, which was a very small, 2-man indie book publisher out of somewhere near Toronto, that had a mandate and a focus on Canadian music writing. I got in touch with them over Twitter. I was familiar with the books they'd put out. They'd put out 2 or 3 by that point. And they said, do you have something? Can you do something large on this subject? And I, of course, naively said, yeah, of course, that'll be easy. And so kind of just dove right in. And I, had done a bunch of these interviews already, just kind of mapped out how could I cover a period of time that seemed to make sense, and just dove in.
Amazing. I love that this kind of started just as a series of smaller pieces. How many interviews did you do whenever you were just doing like the smaller articles before it came in like a much larger project?
I can't exactly recall, but I remember trying to cast a pretty wide net.
Yeah.
And, Winnipeg is a city, but it's also very small towny. And so I didn't want to you're going to leave someone out, but I wanted to make sure that I felt at least like I was covering the bases that I felt were important, or that, I'd always make a point of saying, well, who else should I talk to after talking to someone to see maybe I'd overlook something. And of course I overlook plenty, but that's just, you can't do everything. Right. But probably, at least a half dozen and probably closer to a dozen interviews for each of the pieces. And there was some overlap between them, which is natural in a small scene where people are jumping from band to band, or, we're playing in like an indie band and like a death metal band or whatever, or a grindcore band or something. But I was trying to cast a wide net with, of course, the caveat that I probably didn't get everyone I should have, but my intention was to overdo it, to make it easy to then pull those pieces together.
Yeah. And, you mentioned like the small towny feel, like, something that strikes me so much about reading this book and also knowing some stuff about the Winnipeg music scene that I've come across in the last couple of years is that you have people like Jameel Russell or John K. Sampson or Jason Tate, who like their work branches across different genres and sounds and styles so seamlessly and so effectively that you've got this like really powerful group of people over the last couple of decades that can kind of move in and out of different musical worlds. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that is speaks to their versatility as musicians and artists, but also to the fact that if all you're going to do is listen to punk rock and go to punk rock shows, I mean, there's a scene there, but it's still Winnipeg, so you're not getting, you know what I mean? Like you're going to be not doing a whole lot some nights or some weekends when there's other things happening. You've got a big party in Birds Hill, the Winnipeg Folk Fest, which, I mean, if you're a hardcore punk, you're probably, sneering at. But if you're a music lover in general, whether you tend towards more aggressive or louder music, you're probably going there to check out some artists that otherwise you can't see. So, that lends itself to taking in and listening to a wide range of music, given that if you want to see music and you're a music lover, that's what you're going to do, because you don't have the ability to just silo yourself off. I mean, you can, but then you're going to be missing out on a whole lot of other things that are happening because of the size and remote location of the city, right?
Yeah. Well, okay. So before we dive into the book specifically, I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about the collection of venues that would have shows in all throughout the 90s in this like decade that you've documented. Kind of tell me a little bit about what like the physical spaces were like that you discovered in your conversations, but also in your own personal experiences.
Right. So a lot of the primary venues that would be giving not only medium size or bigger underground bands a place to play, but also providing locals for a place to play. You've got bars like Wellington's, which was in the basement of the St. Charles Hotel. It's been condemned and boarded up for years. I don't know if anything's ever going to go there now. Next door, you had the Royal Albert, which is to this day opening and closing, and people are trying to make a go of it, but its heyday would have been in the 80s and into the 90s, where you had an owner that was very open to getting local bands on the stage, but also promoters that were bringing in kind of bigger punk rock bands or bands from the States or bands from the rest of Canada. So there was an opportunity for local bands to play on draft night and get a taste of the stage, but also to be opening for bands like Green Day or NoFX or whatever. You had kind of more underground venues, which I think were probably closed by the 90s, like the Cauldron and various kind of DIY sort of spaces. You had a larger place like the Rendezvous, which is just across the river in St. Boniface, the neighborhood of Winnipeg. All these are a short bus ride or walk from each other in downtown Winnipeg. The Rendezvous was kind of a bigger room, so you'd get once punk kind of started to get bigger and bigger, you had bands playing, headlining there, and then local bands opening for them. The University of Winnipeg would sometimes put on shows. University of Manitoba, which is way in the south end of town, would host shows. You also had community centers like the West End Cultural Center, places like that would that you could just rent and put on shows. So you had a lot of that at the Broadway Community Center, and even places way out in the old suburbs, which are now part of Winnipeg proper, to St. James or way up into the Kildonans. Kids could rent the hall there and have their bands play, or maybe try to bring one of the bigger local bands to headline and do it. So most of this action was centered around the central part of Winnipeg, downtown, the Exchange, West Broadway or Osborne Village, with the Rendezvous being in St. B. But it would there was lots of opportunities for kids, anyone with a DIY spirit to get something going at community centers or some of these underused halls and spaces in churches or the Belgian Club out in St. Boniface or whatever it might be. So there's lots of opportunity to get that kind of thing going.
Fabulous. Well, let's talk a little bit about the book here. So what does this title mean to you, Missing Like Teeth? Tell me about the title.
So that's pulled directly from a song by the Weakerthans, Left and Leaving, where the line is, "My city's still breathing, but barely. It's true through buildings gone missing like teeth." In Winnipeg, from the downtown Winnipeg is full of surface parking lots now. And I think you saw a lot of that happening before the 90s, but into the 90s, there was, pulling down these old buildings that were kind of, in whose ever minds had seen better days, or whether maybe they legitimately had an issue that it wasn't worth fixing. So they pulled them down and put parking lots in their space, which is a blight upon the whole area to this day. And so John Kay, he writes brilliantly about local issues in a very poetic sense. The song also, talks about people leaving the city, moving to Montreal, which was a big thing. When I first moved to Winnipeg, I thought it was moving to the big city, but everyone from Winnipeg was, they're going to Montreal. They're going to go make it in Montreal. Before that, it was Vancouver. Tons of punks who came up in the 80s ended up moving out to Vancouver in the 90s. And people just always are moving away to Toronto, which you saw also in the end of the 90s and early 2000s. A bunch of those musicians have since moved back to Winnipeg, but that was the pull was to somewhere else, right? And so I thought that captured the spirit of what was happening. And of course, by the time this book came out, most of those bands, with a few exceptions, weren't together in that form or whatever either. So I felt it pulled it all together. Plus, I love that tune. So
yeah, man, it reminds me so much of Buffalo too, where I live, because we have a long history here of pulling down preservation worthy buildings. Like the city of Buffalo tore down a Frank Lloyd Wright designed office building. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was like the Larkin Soap Company had their headquarters in a building that was designed by architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and they tore it down. And just last week in Buffalo, a building was torn down that was actually slated for preservation at one point, but then got torn down. So that makes so much sense to me, because we have tons of surface parking lots too. So it's like so funny, like having visited Winnipeg and then living in Buffalo, seeing the way that those two cities can kind of like be compared in certain ways. It just
Totally.
really
Yeah.
is like so fascinating to think about that connection there for my own life and my own city as well, you know?
Hmm.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the voices represented in the book. I think that I counted in the book that there were 59 voices represented in the book. I may be off if I
That's
miscounted, but
probably true. That sounds about right. And again,
yeah,
there were some folks I'd interviewed for the various articles that maybe the focus was just a little bit past this, so it didn't quite make sense. And again, there is people that I should have tried harder to track down, or it didn't occur to me till after that it would be easy for me to find them. And then there were people who just straight up weren't interested in the project, and that's fair enough too. They've moved on and whatever. So there's at least a dozen more people that I probably should have worked harder at including or cast my net wider. And there's definitely some people who would argue there's a few people who I spoke to that maybe weren't worthy of getting focused on, and maybe had inflated their own involvement. And I mean, that just happens. And that's, everyone's going to have an opinion on that if they were involved in some way back then, but maybe old beefs that got dredged up or something. But I mean, again, it was quite fun to speak to all those people, because most people were pretty interested, for one, that someone was interested in talking about that, apart from the propaganda and weaker thans angle. A lot of these bands, maybe they're still playing music with their friends, or maybe they'd stop playing music altogether, or were doing something completely different that doesn't get the attention that their band from the 90s or early 2000s did, so most folks were pretty happy to revisit this and take a little walk down memory lane. So it was cool.
what was your like kind of method like for like going and doing the interviews? You like going to people's houses, going to bars, going to parks, like kind of what were you doing?
A
Like kind of
little
what was
of
your
a
comfort zone?
little of everything. At that time, I was like working mostly freelance, and I had like a contract job with the music magazine Stylus, which is a CKUW music magazine that in the 90s and into the 2000s was probably, with the exception of the weekly Uptown magazine, the spot for local bands to get do their first interview and or whatever. And it was an opportunity for a lot of writers who went on, and artists who went on to do bigger things, to get their teeth wet. There's a number of free press editors and writers to this day who that's where they started off, was in Stylus. So I was lucky to do that. That was not a full-time gig, but because of that, it afforded me the time to go meet people at their convenience, go for coffee, go for a beer, meet up with them and chat in a park. Went to a couple people's homes and did a number of interviews over the phone, which nowadays that would be more my bag. I don't have quite the time if I were to ever engage in something like this again. I'm sure most of it would all be over Zoom, just for time's sake. But
Yeah.
it was cool to get to meet some of these folks, or some of them I knew in different capacities over the years, and to just kind of spend some time in a different capacity and talking about some period that meant a lot to them, right?
I see the chapters seem to be named after maybe some of your favorite songs. Like you have Sounds Familiar, you have
Right.
Supporting Cast. So I feel like the chapter names stuff that was all kind of meaningful to you from different periods of
I
time.
tried to, pull a theme that was being discussed, and, like as you're trying to put a chronology together, a narrative of some sort from this, you can't like invent a narrative, right? So you have to kind of like pull together themes that make sense. And then from that, I would try to find a lyric or a song title or whatever that spoke to that theme that seemed to be dominant of that chapter, or that couple of years, or however it ended up being broken down.
Nice. You
Which was
got
fun, that's fun
Oh,
for me.
totally. Yeah. I mean, it seems like you had some people that were obviously included their words in the book, but also contributed artifacts too, like Cam Nickel,
He was very keen.
Todd
Yeah,
and
some
Chris from
people.
Propagandy. It seems like you got like a bunch of artifacts that you included in here too. Tell me about digging up those like old physical things for
That was
inclusion.
Cam Nickel is a photographer. There was a few photographers that, if you look again back through Stylus or through the records that these bands put out, a few names that kind of pop up over and over again. And he was one of them who was documenting stuff for zines and doing all that, and just was a guy at the shows with a camera, who was just keen to share some of this stuff, because I think he, must have a blog that he put some of it up. But again, to dig up some of these things that maybe no one had seen in 10 or 15, 20 years, I think for him was a thrill, a bit of interest. Chris and Todd, Chris more so, I wouldn't say hoards a lot of stuff, but holds on to a lot of things, whether it's properly archived or not. I think he's got boxes just full of old show posters and old things that he just held on to over the years, and was, I think, happy to from with a little prodding to dig into that and get me some of that stuff, which was a thrill for me too, to see some of these, kind of water damaged or somewhat stained old pieces of poster and handbills from 30 years ago. That was fun. That was cool. I'm happy that so many people were willing to share.
My favorite one in there is the NoFX 1992 shows in October of 1992, where Propaganda opened and then eventually famously went on to get signed to the record label owned by Fat Mike Burkett from NoFX. So that's kind of like a moment here for me that really connects to my fandom in music from back in the day, seeing that moment where it's like, this is where those two worlds collided and then led to the rise of that record label that went on to be so iconic, Fat Records, because so intertwined. What was it like digging through? I know Stylus was involved. You got some stuff from Stylus and CKUW. What were their archives like?
Stylus, so they have a tiny office in the, I assume it's still there, in like the student union part of the University of Winnipeg, which is right downtown on the border of the West End and downtown in Winnipeg. And they have had, at least, and I'm pretty sure they still do, copies of every issue that they've put out since 1989. And so on days when I would have office hours and have to be in there, and there might not be a whole lot to do, I've already got everything uploaded or edited or whatnot, I would just flip through for my own interest. And that's where, the part of this idea for this came about, was finding that first Propaganda interview, or seeing the first Weaker Thans interview before they'd even put out Fallow or whatever, right? Like discovering that stuff that wasn't online, because no one had taken the time to digitize it, because it's always a staff of 2 or something at that place, right? And there's not funds to do it or whatever. Was just fascinating to me, and wanting to be able to dig into that and share some of that with a wider audience was great. And I mean, good on CKUW for seeing the historic value in that stuff, and kind of keeping a space for people to engage with creativity and local history and politics and all that open and on the air. And I mean, the University of Manitoba station does a similar kind of thing, but just the physical space of CKUW and Stylus at the U of W, right downtown, kind of adjacent to where a lot of this was going on, is kind of invaluable for that scene anyway.
What were some of your favorite interviews that you did? Like, what are some standout memories from that time that you were like, just really blew you away, and that you really hold as like a cherished memory in your own experience?
I mean, the two big kind of bands that I keep going back to, of course, are Propaganda and the Weaker Thans. And I mean, as a kid, those guys seemed like on a level of like famous rock stars, right? But then you realize, they're actually just these dudes. But they were all the guys I talked to from those groups were very generous with their time and supportive of the project. And it really, I mean, I'd met and interviewed them by then anyway in different capacities, so it wasn't like it was a revelation. But looking back at it, those conversations were really open and fun, and I just really value how willing they were to share their time and these stories and kind of support a silly little project like this. I felt that was really cool, and still remains cool to me to this day. So those guys were great. But and then digging around and connecting with there's a couple guys. There's Ted Sim, who I don't know how much he's not really like a chatty type chatty Cathy, but he played drums in SNFU in the 80s and has been involved in a million other kind of projects. He was one of those guys that moved to Vancouver in the 90s and moved back. And I got to know him through his band Trousermouth, which are kind of like a shock punk kind of. They're a funny band, but I got to know them years and years ago. And so sitting down with Ted, and again, he's not just, he's not sitting there waxing poetic about the old days, but he'd offered like a nice little insight here and there about something, and it's just a cool dude to be able to sit and chat with, or run into at a punk show and chat with, and think, oh yeah, that guy is on one of those SNFU records. It's so good. And, played hundreds and hundreds of shows around the world with them, but it's just the most unassuming little guy you'd ever think of. Right. So getting to meet folks like that and get to know them on a personal level, it was cool about the project, but also cool about living in Winnipeg, because that's just what you do if you're going out to shows and meeting people and social in that way. Right.
Yeah. Well, okay, so tell me a little bit about the way you broke down the chapters. I see you have like some time periods, right? You've got a chapter about 1990 to 1992. You've got a chapter about 1993 to 1995. Kind of how did you delineate the time periods for the organization structure?
Again, that kind of just came out of doing a bunch of the interviews, sort of seeing where the scene or the bands were at that time, and noticing some kind of trends. You see, like, some bands were kind of on the rise. No one had really, just kind of trying to map out trends. You've got, the first Propaganda record comes out in 93. And so that had kind of been the culmination of, bands like Red Fisher touring a whole bunch and kind of establishing these connections for the bands that came after them to tour and to do stuff. So you ended up seeing, what is it? A rising tide lifts all boats, or whatever. If it wasn't for the work of this band, this couldn't have happened. And so things kind of moved along a course. And then, of course, once Propaganda gets an album out that's on an international label, it puts a little spotlight on Winnipeg. You're starting to see that whole label and that whole kind of wave of punk rock is getting bigger. So bands are touring, bands are given more opportunity to open and then to go on tour themselves. So it all kind of built, and it just was really just gut instinct on, this seems like a chunk of time that thematically works together. Seems like they made another step here. Oh, there's another wave of bands coming in after. And there was no science to any of it. I did not have any real plan going in. It was a matter of just trying to identify stuff that worked together. And then,
so that brings up a good point. I'm thinking about the methodology of going about making an oral history project for something like this. And I know that in the past, you've casually mentioned to me that maybe there would be some things that you would do differently about if you were going into a project like this now.
mm-hmm.
What were some like methodology, quirks and some things that you discovered about the process that maybe you'd have been like, oh man, I really wish I would have done this way, way, stuff like that. I'm so curious.
Yeah. I would describe the methodology that I used with this as a complete lack of methodology. Completely not knowing what I was doing. I'd read, I don't know how many oral histories of other bands or scenes, and being like fucking just naive and headstrong and stubborn, I figured that this will be a cinch, and it was not a cinch. But I just spent lots and lots and lots of time just trying to make it work. At the same time, at the University of Winnipeg, there was, I don't know how well established they were at the time, but they were emerging and now are established as an oral history center, where I know someone who has gone on to work there. And if I had, I also was on a bit of a deadline. So I was like, I can, and I'm going to get this done quick in this year or whatever. If I had no deadline and time was not a factor, and it was just a project that I was going to work on for years and make the best possible, I would have leaned on them for their knowledge and their methodology and their tips and the equipment that they had to properly archive the interviews and all that stuff. All this stuff was on my phone, which most of it is gone or lost at this point. But they are a great resource that I wish I had the time and the brains, I guess, to go and ask for help for them. Again, it would have probably drawn the project out much longer than I actually had to work with, but it would have, in the end, been a much more complete project, and one that would have been more accessible to. I don't know if anyone is going to do any more research on this subject, but it would have had all those conversations archived, saved, cross-indexed and accessible. And so if anyone is going to take one of these projects on, I would see what kind of local institution offers that kind of support, and whether it's the local library or a university branch or something, because again, it would not have been this project, but it probably would have been a better project if I had asked for some help instead of just stupidly trying to do everything myself the way I thought it could be done.
Because, like, as you know, I mean, on my other podcast, I do a music podcast too, and I release the interviews like online, and they're all downloadable as MP3s. So, like, I feel decent about their archival storage. And I was like, man, I wish Sheldon would have had every single one of these recordings done and then saved, and then in like a, some kind of Google Drive where he can still access them today. Because then I emailed you, I was like, hey, do you still have this interview recorded? And you're like, oh. So I'm like, do you have any of this stuff?
And I know I've got my transcripts somewhere.
Yeah.
In some, either if it's on the hard drive of my old desktop computer or on like a memory drive, or they're not on Google Drive because I've checked there. I'm just looking at my voice memo. I think I saved like one or two of my favorite of the interviews.
Nice.
I've got the Jord interview. I've got John K. Sampson, Biff Naked, Jason, which I assume is Jason Tate. No, that's from years later. So that's not that. Anyway, wow. I've got a handful of the originals there. Derek Riel, I think. So I did have the foresight to save a couple of them. And I don't know why I did not save all of them. I guess it was just space. My old phone probably was running out of space or something. And maybe I thought I had them backed up onto iTunes when you used to be able to do that. And just again, a complete lack of methodology or foresight or skill was involved in this, which again, for the project like this, I tell myself this anyway, the end result is a product much like most of the music that came out of there. It's flawed and unpolished and has more heart than brains in it. And so is somewhat reflective of 90% of the art that came out of that scene, with a couple exceptions of stuff that rose above. But that's not exactly an excuse for my poor methodology. And, again, but that's what I tell myself.
Amazing. Well, definitely find the ones that you still have. Dig into those hard drives, see if you can find those transcripts, because you never know, man. Maybe somebody at the library would be willing to like store these things or something like that. And just, I encourage you, as a person who is interested in the history of rock music myself, I would definitely encourage you to figure out a way to dig those things out. Someday, maybe when you're like on a week off from work or whatever, be like, all right, I'm going to find those dang things today. Anyway, you know what I'm super curious about? A lot of people know the names you mentioned, Propaganda, Weaker Thans. What are some of your other favorites of music from the era that you document in the book? Like maybe some overlooked records that people could go back and like listen to if they want to see kind of like the heart and soul of the scene that's like just below the surface that escaped the local scene, and kind of what was like just below the surface bubbling up, happening, like that people may not have they may not remember now to this day.
Right. I mean, I always I mentioned Kittens before, and you can find their stuff on Apple, but not all the records. The Night Danger EP, which is the last EP they put out, it doesn't exist online to my knowledge anymore. And that record's, it's like 4 or 5 songs, but it's awesome. It's fantastic. They're a band that I absolutely love. They're a lot, kind of like an Amphetamine Reptile kind of vibe to them. And, detractors might say, that's kind of derivative of that scene, but I don't think so. I think it's doing enough of its own. It's got its own angle, especially the like Bazooka and the Hustler record. Like that is a start to finish fantastic record. Tiger Comet also, but Bazooka just they kind of lean into the idiosyncrasies and weirdness and kind of twangy Western, spaghetti Western kind of vibe. I love those records. Absolutely. The Bonaducci's were a great band that, they've, the Democracy of Sleep and K is for Catherine. Those records are awesome. They're really kind of emo-y, but maybe you'd put that under emo, Midwestern kind of emo, but also kind of doing their own thing as well. And I think those records are amazing and should be celebrated. They put out some stuff. They came back, were reunited a few times over the years and put out neat stuff. And the folks in those bands are still active in, their own fun little projects or whatnot. But I really like those two Bonaducci's records as well. There's some heavier stuff, of course, like, you have Malefaction that put out a number of, if you're into that kind of death metal grindcore kind of stuff, like their records stand up with a lot of stuff that was coming out from Canada. And then, of course, they had a really cool political kind of messaging. The singer from that, Travis Tomchuk, is like a university professor in like labor history and whatnot, and a super interesting dude. He's very interesting in and of himself. So yeah, those are some that stick out right away. I love the I Spy record. I mean, that band was from Regina, but moved to Winnipeg, and of course Todd Kowalski, long running member of Propaganda now. But their stuff I really like because it is so raw, and you kind of see where he ends up going as a musician. But those records are as raw as they come, and I love them.
Man, some of my favorite ones too is like Elliot, Ben
Oh
Sigurdsson.
yeah.
Elliot was great. Band from Atlantis
Yeah,
was
that
also
record's
another
really
good
good.
one.
That
Doug
band,
McLean, like,
yes.
dude, I feel like Doug McLean needs to get a little bit of a love here. Tell me a little bit about like what you know about Doug McLean, because he was in so many important bands. Like Painted Thin is amazing.
Yeah,
Band from Atlantis, Bonaducci's, Paperbacks.
right. Yeah, he is a very unassuming, guy who is just a fantastic writer. And that's the thing with his, I mean, musically, all those bands he was in they write catchy songs, they got rocking songs, they're very talented musically, but his lyrics are just, I remember an early interview with where I first heard of them with the Weaker Thans. It was either in Exclaim or in Stylus back in like 98 or 99. I think it was before Left and Leaving came out. It might have been Exclaim, and someone was like, well, who do you listen to, or who should we listen to in Winnipeg? I'm paraphrasing, but he pointed out the Bonaducci's, and he said something along the lines of that the Bonaducci's should have a statue at the ledge of them instead of whoever else. The statues all go up around the legislature, something to that effect. And you can, when you listen to those early Bonaducci's records, Democracy of Sleep in particular, I think John Kay has he sings a little backup on one or two of those songs, but you can see an influence in, from the Propaganda John Kay songs to Fallow, and then especially the jump to Left and Leaving. Yeah. Very similar, focus on the detail to bring out the greater metaphor or whatever. And they're very similar writers in those ways. And I don't think I'm putting words in John's mouth at all, but I think especially at that age, Doug would have been a writer that he looked up to on the local scene, and likely was influenced by.
Yeah, well, and then you got another total legend in the book, Biff Naked.
Yeah.
What was it like interviewing Biff Naked?
She's great. She is another person, very generous with her time, very positive, just a really like a ball of positivity. She's probably the nicest lady, out of that scene, but is, rose to become a rock star of her own, with music videos on Much Music and whatnot. And again, was very generous with her time and spoke very candidly about, the influence of the late 80s, in her case, particularly early 90s scene, had on her and her ability to kind of, her band Gorilla was one that moved out to Vancouver with the other punks, and then quickly, I think, broke up as soon as they hit the coast or whatever, or shortly thereafter. But yeah, she's great. And, she sang on that one SNFU tune from the early 90s there, the mid 90s. And yeah, she's done so much cool stuff, but is not shy about, bringing it back to, getting her started in Winnipeg. I think she grew up in Dauphin originally or something like that, and then moved to the city as a teen. And yeah, she's cool.
Amazing. Well, something that really stands out to me is that, so in October 2021, I was fortunate enough to go to Winnipeg, right, and going there and walking the streets and seeing the Royal Albert and seeing the Burton Cummings Theater and seeing the Park Theater and the West End Cultural Center. I feel like my understanding of this book is so much deeper because I've actually been on those streets. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? Even if only for like 4 days. Um, Tell me a little bit about like, connecting the book to the city and like how if somebody like goes to Winnipeg, what this might, come to mean as opposed to like just like reading it from like,
Right.
Australia or something.
Yeah, fair enough. I feel like the city is its own character because it's got, these it is what it is, right? It's like an isolated, relatively isolated nowadays with the internet. It's a different world, but back in the day, it's 6 to 8 hours from Minneapolis. It's like 12 hours to Thunder Bay. To drive to
Yeah.
Toronto is an ordeal. And then the next, driving to Calgary is 12 hours, which isn't hard to do because it's a straight line, but it's 12 hours, right? So it's an isolated place. It's got its history and it's got character to it as well. So I felt like, the songs of the weaker thens going back to him or Greg McPherson, who's, mentioned a little bit in the book.
Oh, Greg
Some of their
McPherson.
tunes, they're singing about place, and place is very important, whether it's, as a theme or a character in and of itself, or a series. Place stands in for the factors that, lead to the characters making this decision or being unable to achieve this or whatnot. And I think Winnipeg acts as both a limiting factor and also as a catalyst to a lot of the creativity of these bands, right? Whether it's the desire to get out and do something or the desire to prove themselves in a small pool or whatnot. So it's its own character. And I mean, I would hope that you don't have to be here to get it, but I understand that it certainly helps if you know exactly, kind of what you're dealing with when you're walking downtown at night between these one bar and the next bar, and to do
Yeah.
that when it's minus 40 is a different thing.
Yeah.
Stumbling out of the Albert on a Thursday when it's minus 40 in February to try to catch the last bus home is it's a test of will and possibly smarts, but yeah.
What is your, I know there will probably be some repetition from the list that the records that you've already mentioned, but do you have a top 10 or top 10 ish all time favorite Winnipeg records as of late 2023? You don't have to limit it to the decade that the book
Oh,
covers.
that would be difficult, but I could try to go off the top of my head. I'd put, of course, those, Bazooka and the Hustler, though some would say Tiger Comet is better for Kittens. I'm going to put Left and Leaving from the Weaker Thens, as well as John K. Sampson's most recent, like, solo record, not Provincial. I'm
Winter
blanking on the
Wheat,
name. Winter Wheat is so good.
so good.
So good. It'd be hard to pick one of Greg McPherson's, though I love his first one, Balanced on a Pin, a lot.
Okay,
It's
is that the one with
uh
Company Store on it?
nope,
Man,
before
I'm
that.
obsessed with that song.
Company Store is great, but that Balanced on a Pin he's still doing really, like, kind of soft, using his softer voice. He's not gone full rock and roll.
Oh man, he's
Or
intense.
Yeah, but I like it because he's not quite. Yeah, that's a good record. That's one that doesn't exist online either. I'd go with Christine Fellow's Two Little Birds, which you can't find online, but it's so good.
Okay.
Propaganda. I can't really. Which one am I going to pick? That's fucking. You get a probably it's either supporting cast or Today's Empires.
I
Though,
mean,
of
I can give you
course,
both of them. You're still
well,
only up to eight.
yeah, but then you don't want to like. There's so much other good shit in here that I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah,
going to
okay.
end up leaving out. You want to throw some Burton Cummings in there because that guy's
Okay.
a goddamn legend. But which one do you do solo? I kind of like his solo stuff more than the Guess Who. I don't know if that's bad to say, but fucking My Own Way to Rock is a rocking album, and the cover alone is worth putting it on that list. And I'm leaving out all the roots artists and stuff. There's so many good, like, roots Americana type bands, but you probably want to put like Andrew Neville and the Poor Choices first record on there. I think it's self-titled. Scott Nolan's got so many good records as well. I think it's No Bourbon and Bad Radio that's got broken Bad Liver and a Broken Heart on it, which was covered by Hayes Carl and has got a life of its own out there in the world. But that's a Winnipeg songwriter who's also fantastic, but of a completely different world. And I'm probably missing a bunch of good stuff
Oh,
in
of
that.
course
I
you
didn't
are.
even get the Bonaducci's. Got to have Democracy Asleep in the mix there somewhere. Anyway,
Amazing.
that's a poor
Well,
list off the top of my head, but
I'm
that's a good starting point for anyone.
I can hear our friend Sam Thompson from Witch Police Radio screaming a list at me through the internet right now.
Well,
um,
he's got his own tastes that sometimes overlap with mine, but he's got his own. He likes
totally.
ska and that sort of thing, so that's a whole.
Yeah.
I'm
Um,
not even going to get into that.
you
And I
you
didn't
did
mention any hip hop because that's not really my scene. But those Farm Fresh records are awesome, though. I guess they're more of a Brandon band, but there's a lot.
amazing.
There's lots of good stuff.
It's so amazing too that this such an isolated place has such a thriving and vibrant amount of music that has come out of it. It's so inspiring. A question that I do want to ask you is you dedicate the book to a person named Jonah.
Yeah.
Wonder if
Oh
you can
man.
tell me a Jonah story.
So my buddy Yona was a guy who I worked with at Custom Culture, which was like a head shop in Osborne Village back in the day.
Hmm.
And he was like he'd put on shows, and they were for the most part indie, weird kind of stuff, but he'd bring in bands from Montreal and put them up at like a house show. And he was just his company was called Ghost Town Manitoba, and he would put on, yeah, again, book a show at the Pyramid one day and then put on like a house concert the next, whatever he could make happen. But he's just like the sweetest, like most unassuming guy would always, it was hard to kind of hear what he was getting at, because he talked like he's just the most sweetest, most unassuming dude. But he'd be out there taping up his posters himself, minus 40, just was so in love and committed to music that he just would make things happen, whether he took a loss on the show or did well. It didn't really matter. He'd be disappointed if, it didn't go great. And yeah, I don't know. That we just, the weather was, but whatever, but he would just keep doing it. And he was amazing at that. But then he got, I don't want to say he got brain cancer basically and died super
Yeah.
young. And it came on really quick and kind of took, I remember the last voicemail I had where he wanted to go get soup, and I just missed his call, and I'll get a hold of him in a couple of weeks or something. And then he was dead. So I was,
Man.
still think about that guy quite a bit. And I know the U of M radio station, he was a volunteer there. I think he had a radio show there at Ghost Town, Manitoba, but, also helped catalog the CDs and do all that. And they named they've got a really cool studio for live performance and for recording that bands can book and rent at the radio station there at the U of M. And I believe that is named in his honor, named after him after he passed away, because he was just such a beauty. He was a real sweet dude.
Fabulous. Well, what a great tribute for the book dedication as well. I'm glad that we got to chat about Yona a little bit. So, Sheldon, tell listeners out there how to track down this book if they would like to read it in some way.
The best way is going to be, like, I don't use Kindle because I just don't. I don't know, but that's the only way to do it. So you got to have either a Kindle or a e-reader of some kind. Occasionally, I think there's 500 copies of this ended up getting run over a couple printings, and they're all gone. Like the Eternal Cavalier closed up shop a number of years ago, and so occasionally they pop up on Amazon used, and people are putting a price tag of over $100 or something on these. And I don't know if people are buying them or not, but that's the only way to do it. I hope one day, not that I would want to do the work to like fix all my, omissions or whatever, spelling quibbles, this and that in the book, but I'd love to see it have a secondary print run, even if it was limited one day, but I don't know if that's going to happen. But at this point, you can get it off Amazon, Kindle, and that's going to be your best bet.
Well, I got to give a special shout out to my friend Jamie Fougere in Winnipeg, who tracked down a copy in a bookstore in a rural town.
On and all, that is far away from Winnipeg. I know his wife's family have a cabin nearby, so he may have just secured it and we're going up there in 2 weeks. Like, I'm getting your last copy, but yeah, good for him. That guy's a beauty in and of himself.
That is this copy right here. Jamie went there, got it, and mailed it to me. And
That's
I
amazing.
could not believe, he's like, you of all people with your obsession with Winnipeg music have to have this book. So huge shout out to Jamie for procuring me the very last copy
That
for
was
sale
the
in his
last
store.
one. That's the last one. And if there's any for sale now, I would, if you happen across one in a used bookstore, then buy it. You can resell it on
Amazing.
Amazon if nothing else.
Well, Sheldon, Birnie, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you about your book, Missing Like Teeth, an oral history of Winnipeg underground rock from 1990 to 2001. I have loved our conversation. I've loved being your pal for the last 3 years in our various collaborations. And I look forward to chatting with you about your novels on some forthcoming episodes that we'll be doing in the coming months. Thank you so much for being here and joining me and geeking out about the specialness of the Winnipeg underground music scene. It's been such a pleasure.
My pleasure, man. It's all mine.